So good morning to everybody and to people in other time zones. Good afternoon and welcome to the Living in Oneness Summit. Today is day 5. We started the summit just this past Wednesday, and you might have overheard our conversation where the summit runs for 12 consecutive days, at least 2 programs each day. Today there are 3 programs. I'll tell you more about the other programs toward the end of the hour. I'm Steve Farrell, the Worldwide Coordinating Director for Humanities Team, and we have a very large listening audience with us today. Over 15,000 people have registered for the summit, and the numbers are still climbing. It's great to have you with us. We have an incredible day in store, and just invite you to get comfortable and maybe grab a glass of water or some tea. We're broadcasting live each day with at least 2 programs, and we're talking about how we can come fully alive as part of the divine. That's the focus of this summit, coming fully alive as part of the divine. Today is Mother's Day, so I want to share Happy Mother's Day to all of you mothers who are listening to the program and all of the mothers of the world. Mothers are such wonderful models of oneness, of unconditional love, of forgiveness, and of course we love them dearly in our home, but it's interesting, I think Mother's Day fits so well with the Living in Oneness Summit. It's no wonder that the summit is happening during Mother's Day because they are such incredible models of oneness. So I want to say Happy Mother's Day to my mother who's been listening to the summit, Linda Farrell Small out in Virginia, and also to my wife, Stephanie Farrell, here in Boulder, Colorado. Sending both of you so much love. And let's take a moment of silence just to honor all the mothers of the world. Let's just go quiet for a second and just feel their heart energy and just the magnificent job that they do and how blessed we are to have these beautiful, these incredible mothers in the world. All right, big standing applause to all of you, and I'm now going to introduce you to our special guest for the hour. You're going to love his wisdom and the person, and our special guest is Steve McIntosh, JD. He is a leader in the integral philosophy movement and the author of Evolution's Purpose, an integral interpretation of the scientific story of our origins, that's 2012, and Integral Consciousness in the Future of Evolution, how the integral worldview is transforming politics, culture, and spirituality. That's 2007. He currently works as a founding partner of the new social policy foundation, the Institute for Cultural Evolution. Steve and his family live in Boulder, Colorado, and I've had the great pleasure to meet him. He's just a great guy, and it's so terrific that you can be part of this summit. Steve, and welcome to the Living in Oneness Summit.
Thanks very much, Steve. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and get started. When Steve and I, once again, we're both living right here in Boulder, so it made it real convenient to talk about his program. And there really are 4 major dimensions to his program. I'll just read them real quick. We're going to go through these during the hour. The first one is My Life in Progressive Spirituality. The next is the need for spiritual leadership and the shortcomings of progressive spirituality. The third, the elements of evolutionary spirituality. And then the fourth, the spiritual experience of beauty, truth, and goodness. So that's going to be a lot of fun to step through that. And then if we have time, there are other really incredible things that Steve does. There's a group of conscious business executives, including the CEOs of Whole Foods and Patagonia, that get together, and they invite a couple of leaders in each year. And Steve's been invited to that gathering. So spiritually conscious business is one of the focuses of the summit, and if we have time, we can get to really incredible topics like that. Well, Steve, let's go ahead and start in, and I think maybe the first area we were going to explore was this My Life in Progressive Spirituality.
Sure. Well, I can say a few things about that. It was back, I was born in 1960, and always felt growing up that there was a kind of a renaissance going on that I was missing because I was too young. I was too young to participate in the 60s and be a hippie and go to Woodstock. And I always felt deep down that was something that I was born to participate in some kind of cultural emergence or renaissance of some kind. And all my life I kind of hungered for that. So then in the early 70s, as I came of age as a teenager, a lot of the momentum of the 60s, as it became gradually assimilated into the larger society, one of the things that really appeared culturally was what for lack of a more agreed upon label to describe the whole movement as a whole, progressive spirituality. You know, for a while the term New Age was sort of stood for that, like especially in the 90s, but that term has become a little worn out, so we don't really use that term, and a lot of people misunderstand what we're talking about because there's elements of progressive spirituality for which the New Age label doesn't really fit. But what I'm talking about is the emergence of originally countercultural interest in spirituality, a renewed interest in spirituality that was sort of beyond the mainstream, you know, a reclaiming of, much of it was reclaiming and finding the wisdom of the East and the esoteric wisdom of the West, and sort of reclaiming a lot of pre-modern or, you know, pre-Enlightenment spirituality. But a lot of progressive spirituality as it was emerging in the 70s also had a postmodern flavor, a countercultural flavor, whereby there was a syncretic kind of mixing and matching, and it was a fabulous time in the 70s. And I was particularly drawn as I became an enthusiastic participant in it, you know, reading everything I could, going to as many gatherings and events, and just immersing myself in that culture at the time where I grew up in Southern California. I was particularly interested in the elements of progressive spirituality that were looking at the intersection of science and spirituality. I remember in 1975 when Fritjof Capra's book, The Tao of Physics, you know, first came out. It was very exciting, the idea that, you know, the cutting edge of science was beginning to confirm and rediscover things that had been known, you know, to ancient mystics for thousands of years. And it was also during that time that Marilyn Ferguson wrote The Aquarian Conspiracy, where she highlighted all the different ways that leading-edge science was sort of coming to spiritual conclusions. And this was a very exciting time for me, and I realized that this would be my life, that I was drawn to this, and it felt, in the 70s at least, somewhat like the kind of spiritual renaissance that I had been, you know, attuned to and hoping for and longing for. But then I realized by the late 70s that in order to really participate in this, I couldn't just be, you know, a hippie counterculturalist person. I needed some establishment credentials. So in the 80s, I got an education. I went to business school, I went to law school, and I, you know, went to work in the establishment for a while with the idea of sort of gaining credentials and experience and maybe even a little capital. And then in the 90s, progressive spirituality, in a sense, experienced the fluorescence. You know, in other words, it had emerged. You know, we can trace it all the way back to, you know, the Romantics in the 18th century, or to the Transcendentalists, you know, Thoreau or Emerson. I mean, there's a long and interesting history of progressive spirituality, but it really emerges as a demographic movement and, you know, significant, you know, more than just an intellectual community. It becomes a real social force in the 70s. Continuing in the 80s, but somewhat underground in the Reagan years. But then in the 90s, it experiences a full-blown fluorescence where it becomes much more mainstream. In the 90s, you know, popular authors like Deepak Chopra and Marianne Williamson and Neil Donald Walsh, you know, all become household names, at least in certain quarters in American society, and of course worldwide. But you know, just focusing on America to keep things you know, kind of simple here, and as we're talking about the history of progressive spirituality, it was in the 90s that I realized that that the calling that I had felt as a teenager was really calling me to jump back in, to participate in the emergence of progressive spirituality. You know, I was living here in Boulder at the time, and this really, looking back on it, was an epicenter of the emergence of progressive spirituality in the 90s. How, for example, again, it used to be called New Age. The New Age category of books became the largest category of books by far, dwarfing every other category. Thousands of New Age bookstores opened across the country. And you know, some of the more accessible elements of progressive spirituality, such as yoga and meditation and positive thinking, these all became well infused into the, you know, in other words, much of the countercultural isolation of progressive spirituality, a lot of that was overcome as progressive spirituality became much more prominent within American society. And this trend of it being a significant demographic and a vibrant, growing community of people who are interested in, thousands of different kinds of eclectic spirituality, which all found a kind of a home within cultural unity, even though people may have been practicing their particular form of spirituality or following their, a niche within this larger cultural agreement. There was a unified culture, although, eclectic and pluralistic, of people who are interested in alternative forms of spirituality. And, of course, that significant segment of the culture continues to be a major demographic in American society today. But it's also, in other ways, not taken seriously by the mainstream. In other words, if you look at the mainstream media, like an intellectual program like the Charlie Rose television program or the New York Times or any of the major media outlets, the American universities, there are very few places where progressive spirituality and its teachings and its insights and its important discoveries have gained traction. It remains countercultural. And since the recession, I think some of the momentum, that we originally saw in the 90s has leveled off a bit. And, this is not a huge knock on progressive spirituality. It's rescued spirituality from death at the hands of modernism in certain ways and shown how the human impulse for spiritual growth and spiritual truth and spiritual experience, that can't be quashed, that continues to emerge even beyond, the confines of the mythic pre-modern forms of spirituality that we've inherited from our past. So progressive spirituality is a beautiful thing, and it's kind of been the focus of my life from a very young age. But it was, in the late 90s, as I was working, I had created a company, the goal of which was to create, our tagline was cultural artifacts of the spiritual renaissance. I intuited that along with this cultural fluorescence, there'd be an art movement, sort of like Art Nouveau or Art Deco or some historical expression of the zeitgeist that would exemplify and demonstrate the cultural sense of progressive spirituality. And I invented some products that were, aesthetic expressions of that. There's an alarm clock and a lot of other things that my company Now and Zen had produced. But the art movement that I had anticipated and the, the Renaissance that the 90s really kind of promised to produce never quite materialized. In other words, progressive spirituality, although it's made important inroads and gained a large following, in terms of its ability to create a more unifying sense of social solidarity within the United States, a kind of an agreement that spirit by whatever name is real, and that we are all one, and that we are all in this together, and the sense of moral unity that when spirituality functions at its best occurs among those who are drawn to it and follow it. That could be better. In other words, progressive spirituality, or American spirituality in general, for all its accomplishments, I think I would love to see it be, more prominent, taken more seriously by the larger society, being able to provide more spiritual leadership, helping people to raise their consciousness for very important issues that just don't have political will right now, like climate change. There are political implications for spiritual leadership, and so this sense of responsibility that I have for progressive spirituality, having, in a sense, dedicated my life to it, makes me unsatisfied. In other words, we want to make it better. We want to make it more true, more beautiful, and more good, more effective. And that's sort of the theme of my work: the beautiful, the true, and the good. It informs both my spiritual work and the work that I'm doing in politics. You mentioned at the beginning the Institute for Cultural Evolution. We're employing some of the insights about the evolution of consciousness and culture that come from this entity, evolutionary spirituality, which I'm about to explain. And in some ways, evolutionary spirituality, which is this emergent new form of spirituality that that stands on the shoulders of the accomplishments of progressive spirituality, but endeavors to go farther, endeavors to transcend and include. And like all, movements toward greater truth, it's a ladder of distinctions. That's how truth works. Beauty is inclusive, truth is inclusive, goodness is inclusive, but truth, in a way, is trying to break out of the status quo. It's a direction of evolution, if you will, toward the more real. But in order to get to what's more real, what's more true, and eventually what's more good and beautiful, there's a certain amount of distinctions that have to be made. It's like, as I mentioned, a ladder. And so evolutionary spirituality endeavors to become the next rung on the ladder of humanity's cultural and spiritual evolution. And part of the way it does that is, as I said, it builds on progressive spirituality, but it also tries to overcome, the shortcomings of progressive spirituality, which can be seen in the many ways that the mainstream has yet to fully appreciate it. In other words, the mainstream doesn't take it seriously enough, partially because of an embrace of magical thinking, which is good, right? Progressive spirituality is open and pluralistic. It lets 1,000 flowers bloom. But along the way, among, some superlative blossoms, there's a few weeds in there, and so weeding the garden, if you'll allow that analogy, is part of what evolutionary spirituality, is attempting to do. So at this point, what I'd like to do is sort of mention what I'm calling the elements of evolutionary spirituality. Like, what is this thing, evolutionary spirituality? And then that'll lead to really where I'm going to, and that is the spiritual experience of the beautiful, the true, and the good. How evolutionary spirituality, part of the way that it makes its advance in consciousness and culture, is by expanding and clarifying and deepening our understanding of what spiritual experience is. In other words, when people experience spirit, what is the reference of that? There's plenty of explanations. Absolute oneness, God, the leaking of the infinite into the finite. I mean, there's many ways of understanding it, and understanding it philosophically, understanding it through a kind of philosophical technology, is what this concept of beauty, truth, and goodness can do. It's really a conceptual cathedral. It's philosophical high technology properly understood, because these concepts, the beautiful, the true, and the good, since ancient times, have been recognized as, in a sense, the most intrinsic values, the sort of the highest values. Love is, of course, in there too. For some, beauty, truth, and goodness equal love. Others, love see love as a kind of a species of goodness. Love is the desire to do good to others. But we don't want to put too much emphasis on these words or get too tied down to them. What we're trying to name and describe, and therefore come to know better, is spiritual experience. And spiritual experience has many forms, of course. It is usually conceived in terms of mystical experiences of the unitive state, where subject and object collapse. Spiritual experience has been understood as through epiphanies of all kinds. But one of the ways that evolutionary spirituality expands our hold on what spiritual experience is by showing us how that which we find to be most beautiful, true, and good are direct experiences of spirit. And seeing these value experiences, these hits of intrinsic value, as little glimpses of the infinite, little glimpses of dynamic unity within the phenomenal world, this helps us not only have these experiences more abundantly, but share them more effectively. And that's one of the things that make the beautiful, the true, and the good such a powerful addition or supplement to our regular notions of spiritual experience and spiritual growth, is that these elements, these sometimes have been called the comprehensible elements of divinity or deity. That is, these are the ways that spirit speaks to us and reaches us in our daily lives. But these values can not only be experienced, they can be shared. Right? In other words, beauty is something that we can express. We can make art. We can make music. We can make our homes more beautiful. We can make ourselves more beautiful. And this beauty, in a sense, gives spiritual experience to others. Same could be said with truth. Right? Much of this conference is about truth teaching, spiritual truth, and people are edified by it. Indeed, it raises their consciousness. It makes them more real through the experience of this wisdom. And all of this beauty and truth can be kind of understood as the two legs of goodness, right? They're how goodness makes progress, how goodness enters the world. Goodness is the right relation. It's the circle of care by which we are all one. Our moral unity, in a sense, is created by goodness, and this is a direction of advance. It's one of the ways that we can make the world a better place, is by making it more loving, making it more good, making it more inclusive, more caring, more moral. So these values, as I'm talking about them, they're not platonic forms or substances or things. They're little flashes of the infinite within the finite. And understanding them philosophically, understanding them experientially, and framing them within this emerging new form of understanding, which is evolutionary spirituality, I think can empower us culturally and politically to provide more effective forms of spiritual leadership for the larger society. I think it can make us more persuasive, make us more attractive, and make us more effective at raising consciousness and make, moving in the direction of a world that works for everyone, which I think most people who are involved in progressive spirituality, they have that goal. They want to see an environmentally friendly, compassionate, caring world, and we live currently in a world of trouble and suffering. So engaging these problems and getting involved in trying to raise consciousness and make things better is, one of the ways we can achieve our own spiritual growth. That's one of the big insights of evolutionary spirituality, and it's not exclusive to evolutionary spirituality, but it's certainly the greater focus and the pragmatic details of how we can raise consciousness, how consciousness has been raised in history, how the forms of emergence have occurred within human consciousness and culture throughout the ages. We're coming to understand that more completely through this deeper understanding of evolution, and that's leading to what we hope will be more effective ways of making the world a better place. So let me just tick off the elements of evolutionary spirituality. Emerson, the American sage Ralph Waldo Emerson, is one of his famous sayings is that every natural fact is a symbol of some higher spiritual fact. And so if we look at the universe that's been disclosed by science, especially in the last few decades, the story of evolution from the initial emergence, the momentous flashing forth that's been termed the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. Since the debris of the Big Bang, since the hydrogen gas that was left over from the initial explosion, evolution has been gradually building on itself. There's been this sequence of emergence. There's a structure of emergence beginning with hydrogen and helium through the periodic table of elements, through the evolution of species in biology, and through the evolution of consciousness and culture over the last 40,000 years. These are all authentic forms of evolution, and evolutionary spirituality recognizes that this picture of evolution, this kind of grand narrative, from hydrogen gas to Beethoven, if you will, this itself, this story of evolution, including both nature and history, is a spiritual teaching in itself. It's kind of a revelation, because properly interpreted, this natural fact, the facts of evolution, teach us about the larger spiritual reason or purpose for the evolving finite universe. Why has the universe come into being? There are plenty of explanations, and many of them are true. But evolutionary spirituality begins to show us this with a kind of a new clarity that is building on what science has shown us. In other words, we can see that evolution is creating value. Something more keeps coming from something less. And yet, when the something more emerges from the something less, it takes up the accomplishments of the earlier level and uses it, incorporating it into itself. And this structure of emergence, since the Big Bang, through life, and now through human consciousness and culture, is pointing toward how things are becoming better. What is better? What is value? What is beautiful, true, and good? What is love? These are things which evolution is moving towards, and it's moving in these directions through us. In other words, we embody evolution. The hydrogen molecules or atoms that are in our water molecules, hydrogen's only created at one time in the universe, in the Big Bang. That's it. All the hydrogen that ever existed, was created 13.8 billion years ago. And yet those atoms are now the foundation of our biological reality. We're using the accomplishments of hydrogen in this very moment, as well as the accomplishments of iron and carbon, and the accomplishments of the vertebrate and the neuron. All of these forms of emergence, all of these ways in which something more has emerged from something less in the course of evolution, are now kind of online and functioning within us. And not only are the physical accomplishments of cosmological and biological evolution functioning and online within who we are in this moment in our bodies, but all the accomplishments of history, all of the emergences of consciousness that have helped us expand our sense of morality, or expand our sense of what's true, all of the ways that humanity has produced the beauty, the great art and music and exquisite creations of civilization. All of these things, in a sense, contribute to the consciousness that we have now. The language that's functioning within us is also part of this emergent evolutionary structure. And because we embody evolution in its fullness, all of the forms of emergence, practically all of them, are within us, we also can feel evolution's purpose within ourselves. This isn't something that necessarily we have to read off of the structure of emergence. We can feel it within us. We have a direct phenomenological confirmation that evolution is purposeful, that it's trying to make progress, that this is known as the evolutionary impulse. And it's an element of evolutionary spirituality. That is, the impulse we feel to grow, to do our best, to do our duty, to live up to our obligations, to grow spiritually, right? This urge that many of us, indeed most of us, feel to live up to our potential and do the right thing. This is, in a sense, the purpose of evolution coursing within us. To be human is to know what it feels like to be evolution happening. And so evolutionary spirituality kind of brings out the spiritual teachings of the history of evolution and the force of evolution in this moment, in the present moment, that's working with us as we seek the beautiful, the true, and the good. Evolutionary spirituality could also be called beauty, truth, and goodness spirituality, because that's really the essence of its focus, and in some very important ways, its method. That's how evolutionary spirituality attempts to add to all of the beautiful spiritual culture that's already come before, by finding this ancient wisdom of the beautiful, the true, and the good, connecting it to the evolutionary story of our origins, and showing how it helps us understand spiritual experience more thoroughly. One of the promises of this deeper understanding of spiritual experience and the receiving of it and the giving of it is that we're coming to see that every problem in the world, except for perhaps a volcano exploding or a tsunami, but most problems that we can see, whether it's hunger, poverty, disease, war, global warming, all of these problems can be understood as at least partially problems of consciousness. If we could find a way to raise the consciousness of people who are creating these problems or failing to prevent them, we'd have an effective method for improving the human condition in dramatic ways. And the method of spiritual experience, if you will, promises to show us how to more effectively raise consciousness. In other words, just like one of the things that made the Enlightenment, right, the European and American emergence that occurred in the 17th and 18th centuries that brought us the modern world for good and for bad. One of the good things that the Enlightenment created was science and the scientific method, which led to scientific medicine, right? Nothing's improved the human condition more dramatically in the last several centuries than the advent of scientific medicine. We take it for granted now, but when a good portion of your children would die from diseases you didn't have anything, any cure for, this is a horrific part of life which has been ameliorated, at least in the developed world, through scientific medicine. So if this new emergence that we all hope for, this spiritual renaissance, that I think many of us yearn for, is to be as effective in changing consciousness and culture and making, humanity better off as much as, say, the advent of scientific medicine, we're going to need something equivalent, something powerful, something methodical, something we can use to make things better. And one of the things that's coming out of evolutionary spirituality is that we're coming to see that raising consciousness really does occur through spiritual experience. If we understand that all evolution is, in a sense, spiritual growth, broadly conceived, we can also see that spiritual experience in history is what has raised consciousness, right? During the American Revolution, Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet, Common Sense, struck a chord of truth, which, in a sense, persuaded, the people of the United States to revolt against the world's greatest superpower, which led to the United States. It was the truth of it, the juice of it, that really raised the consciousness of people. I mean, in the 60s, a similar form of emergence, when Bob Dylan sang "The Times They Are Changing," the beauty and the truth that were the juice inherent in that song, the way that it expressed the zeitgeist, actually raised people's consciousness beyond modernism into this kind of countercultural space. Many who remain in this cultural world space today can trace this emergence back to some of the original beauty of the music that emerged as part of the rise of postmodernism in the 60s. So the point is that what we're beginning to discover, what we're working on in the realm of evolutionary spirituality, is a technique for raising consciousness through the skillful application of the beautiful, the true, and the good in a way that creates spiritual experience sufficient to raise consciousness and, in a sense, solve problems by raising consciousness in ways that we don't currently have the technology to do it. In other words, as we develop this method, wherever we find consciousness and culture, we'll be able to improve it by expanding what people can value, expanding the scope of those that they consider worthy of moral consideration, expanding the sense of what's true and beautiful and good. It's like a kind of a social medicine that can heal the wounds of history, and this can help us, evolve beyond many of the troubling circumstances we find ourselves here in at the beginning of the 21st century. So when we focus on what's beautiful, true, and good, and how that creates spiritual experience, part of it is that we understand that what is the beautiful, the true, and the good, right? Plato, for whom the triad is originally attributed, back in the the 4th century BC, he talked about beauty, truth, and goodness as, in a sense, the primary values. Just like three colors on your computer screen, RGB, can combine and contrast to produce the entire visual field, it's been argued that the beautiful, the true, and the good, in a sense, are like the primary forms of quality, which color the world with quality. In a sense, they're like the primary values that can be contrasted and combined to produce all the forms of goodness that people can appreciate and share. And since Plato, some of the greatest minds of humanity, including Thomas Aquinas or Alfred North Whitehead, have really been drawn to a deeper philosophical understanding of these primary values. Alfred North Whitehead was particularly drawn to the power of this philosophical understanding of spiritual experience. He wrote that beauty is the final contentment of the eros of the universe. In other words, the evolution of the universe has been moving toward the direction of beauty since the beginning. And, for Whitehead, truth and goodness were species of beauty. For Plato, it was the opposite. Goodness was the highest value. But regardless of how we combine this triad, what makes them function together as a system of understanding and not just a convenient list or a contrived heuristic framework, if you will. The beautiful, the true, and the good are really, they're naming the directions of evolution, and they are disclosing spirit in a way. It's sort of like a natural form of spirituality. It's compatible with truth teachings from the great wisdom traditions, but it gives us a way of thinking about spirit that doesn't rely on spiritual teachers or texts. And, of course, this is part of its leadership potential, is that it can be agreeable to a wide variety of people, even while it can create unity. And so we come to understand the beautiful, the true, and the good as forms of spirituality, one of the ways of understanding them is as the presence of the infinite in the finite. In other words, the finite becomes thin. The phenomenal world of appearances becomes diaphanous or transparent in the experience of the beautiful, the true, and the good, wherein these forms of spiritual reality are kind of shining through, the phenomenal or mundane world. The non-dual teacher Ramana Maharshi he used this analogy of the phenomenal world being, like a movie projected on the screen, and that the movie is just the flickering light, but the screen behind is where the ground is. And when the movie projected on the screen becomes transparent and you can see the screen from underneath, that's a way of talking about the experience of the beautiful, the true, and the good, is these little flashing glimpses of ultimate unity that come to us downstepped enough, to be recognizable and indeed usable and shareable in these forms of spirit, in the world. But not only do they make spirit visible, not only do these values kind of disclose, the infinite to our experience, but the beautiful, the true, and the good also have a gravity. They're like tractor beams, because when you begin to metabolize, if you will, when you begin to bring the experience of these values into your consciousness, it creates a kind of a channel where it opens the aperture. The more beauty you experience, if you're using it as a spiritual practice, if you're understanding it as a spiritual experience, you're naturally drawn to want more. There's a sense in which these forms of intrinsic value are pulling us and extolling us to grow, to feel loved, to love others. This is how we can understand the beautiful, the true, and the good as that is not only are they experiential aspects of spirit, but they're also how we co-create the universe. There's an important teaching of evolutionary spirituality is that we are agents of evolution, that we're in the finite universe not just as passive witnesses, but to actively perceive what is more perfect by our own lights and act upon that. In other words, because we embody evolution thoroughly, and because we live in this world that is in so much in need of evolution, of improvement on so many fronts, our spiritual duty, if you will, our golden opportunity is to participate in the perfection of the universe, if you will, or the improvement of the human condition. There's plenty of ways to language it. But making things more beautiful, true, and good gives us a practical way of understanding what our duty is. It also is, it engages our evolutionary impulse, which I spoke of earlier. This urge within us to grow and to seek spiritual experience. That impulse, that urge is kindled and made stronger and can focus more clearly on what's spiritually real. The more we use it, the more we bring the beautiful, the true, and the good into the world, the more we're able to feel the pull, the gravity of these values on our consciousness. And I guess part of the way we can understand how the beautiful, the true, and the good are ways of understanding spiritual experience, in a very high-powered form of philosophical technology that opens our mind to what spiritual experience is and how it can be had and shared. We can see how, in a sense, these comprehensible elements of deity, as I spoke of earlier, that they're in a sense giving us messages, that they are literally communicating spiritual messages to us in the form of these values. And the beautiful, the true, and the good communicate to us in two ways, two kinds of messages, as I'll now explain. One can be understood as instructions for perfecting the universe, for spiritual growth, and the other is as assurances, messages of love, if you will. So I've been talking about beauty, truth, and goodness, and these values can't be, clearly defined. Well, what is beauty, right? And philosophers have been trying to come up with an agreeable definition of that since antiquity. Thomas Aquinas called it unity, proportion, and clarity. But although that's interesting and useful, it doesn't really get at what these values are. And part of the reason they can't be defined is they're not objects. Part of the proof of the fact that the beautiful, the true, and the good are authentic spiritual experiences, that they're the presence of the infinite and the finite, is that they can't be defined. They can't stand still and become objects because they're neither completely objective nor completely subjective. They're sort of unifying everything they touch. They unify subject and object in the course of their experience. So part of the way we begin to see how these are instructions is that these concept labels open up into entire dimensions of experience. So, for example, beauty is a label which we can understand to stand for an entire dimension of aesthetic excellence and pleasure. All the ways that we can experience beauty, both, the rarefied beauty of fine art and, the hearty good fun of an afternoon of adventure. I mean, it is beauty, pleasure, aesthetic excellence, this entire dimension of what we might call a Dionysian, experience of enjoyment that comes from beauty of every kind. That these are instructions for making beauty, making things more beautiful, edifying people, just demonstrating unity. This entire dimension is not just a singular concept, but an entire direction of evolution. And just as beauty in a stance stands for Dionysian, pleasure and exquisite joy, truth is in a sense the opposite. I mean, the positive opposite, in the sense that truth is about growth and achievement and becoming more real, discovering what's more real. If beauty is Dionysian, truth is Apollonian, right? It's about the heroic quest to make things better and to become more real in the process. And so just as beauty gives us instructions about, the how to make things more pleasurable and enjoyable, truth, in a sense, broadly understood as a dimension of evolution, explains to us how technically, physically, actually, things can be made better, how we can break out of the inertia of the status quo and, really look forward to better states of affairs, a fairer world that works for everyone. The direction of that evolution is toward, greater truth, goodness, and beauty. But truth is, in a sense, that Apollonian, striving to make things better, which is a very important part of the triad. But, striving to make things better, as we've seen in history, can run amok. Things, some of the best intentioned efforts to make things better have ended up making things much worse. So it's important to learn those lessons from history and see how truth, in a sense, to be true to itself, always has to bend toward goodness. It always has to serve people. It always has to make things better in a way that makes the environment or makes the human culture, makes people better, in tangible ways that they can appreciate. So if goodness and if truth and beauty are these instructions, for making things better, sort of instructions at the level of the soul. They're not detailed step-by-step how-to guides, not necessarily a self-help program, but when you practice beauty, truth, and goodness, when you come to understand these things as spiritual experiences, you can tune in to how they are giving us instructions for what could be more evolved in detail. They're speaking to our higher selves and not only telling us what, but also how and why to make things better. I mentioned instructions. The other way that the beautiful, the true, and the good communicate to us is as assurances, as messages of love. I mean, when you feel that the pleasure that's available to every person through the beauty, that's in the universe, the messages feel loved. Feel that even here and now, even in this, in this existence here in the physical realm, even on this, planet, which is in so much need of growth, and it's a world of trouble and suffering, beauty is still abundant. It's still permeating, our experience if we allow ourselves to see it and be contacted by it. And the pleasure, the in the now sense of just being loved that comes from a beauty experience properly felt, properly interpreted, is literally a message to feel loved. In the same way that that beauty, gives us the message of feeling loved, the message of truth in the universe, the message that the universe is intelligible and that we can make things better, that we can grow through science and philosophy and spirituality, that truth does make things better and it does cause people to agree. It does bring them into greater solidarity. It does teach them how to solve problems. The message of truth is that the way of growth is open before us, that we can perfect the universe, we can make it better, that a better world is possible by our growth in spirit. And so if the message of beauty is feel loved and the message of truth is grow, then the message of goodness, the assurance, the spiritual message of love that comes from the experience of goodness and the fact that goodness is in the world, despite the evil, despite the trouble and suffering. That is, we've all experienced goodness, and we know that there's greater goodness yet to come, that more goodness can be brought. We all have confidence that things can be made better and that spiritual growth is possible. So the message of goodness, I think, properly understood, is feel loved and love others. In other words, that is almost every form of authentic spirituality teaches us to love one another. And, in order to not let that admonition to love one another fall into a stale cliche, that we all sort of know that we should do, but it's hard. Jesus' teaching to love your neighbor as yourself can be an extremely difficult admonition for spiritual practice. Some people find it, that they can do it naturally, but others, most of us, we do well to refresh that spiritual teaching within ourselves and to remember it in moments when we're taxed. And this teaching of to love others, the fact that we are all part of this one universal family, the fact that that deep down there is this moral unity, which is a kind of a foundation of reality. That's something that has to be practiced. It's something that has to be nurtured and kindled and always renewed. And this philosophical, spiritual understanding of the beautiful, the true, and the good acts as a kind of a compass heading, which can, help us understand conceptually, philosophically, mentally, things which we know in our heart, but which we do well to focus on more concretely in our work in the world and in every situation where we're challenged to grow. So, Steve, I've been talking a mile a minute here, and I should probably let you get a word in edgewise, but I do appreciate you letting me just kind of let the train leave the station here a little bit in my talking about the beautiful, the true, and the good and evolutionary spirituality and the promise it has for improving progressive spirituality and helping it move to a next phase so it can be more agreeable to a wider segment of the population of the developed world and fulfill its promise of leading to a spiritual renaissance. And I think that this new understanding of beauty, truth, and goodness and the evolutionary spirituality that contains it is one of the ways that progressive spirituality can move toward this its deep mission of spiritual renaissance.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, Steve. I know I'm speaking for everybody. I feel like I'm curled up, next to a fire and just sitting here listening to you. You've covered so much ground talking about this evolutionary framework for spirituality with all of its dimensions, starting out with progressive spirituality and moving into spiritual leadership, and then, of course, all of the evolutionary nature, and then bringing it into contemporary society and things that we can consider. And I love where you ended up, that we don't want to fall into this stale cliche, of loving ourselves and one another, but consider that a real call to action, in today's world, the Jesus example. I love that we ended up there. So I'm guessing we've got some comments here from listeners too that where they're asking about different things. We've only got about 11 minutes, so we won't be able to probably get to questions. But just fascinating, this whole framework that you took us through, Steve. Well, in our we have a hard stop, by the way, at the half hour. The way we're doing this program, the tapes, everything stops. There's a hard stop right there at the half hour. So at 25 after, we'll kind of go into the wrap-up so I can be sure to get some things in before we close. So just with the 5 minutes we've got before we go into wrap-up, I mentioned at the beginning that you've been called in by this conscious business leadership group who has the CEO of Patagonia, the co-CEO of Whole Foods, and other incredible leaders, and they've asked you to come back. I can see why, by the way, just because in the way that you can pull together a framework like this and share so much information that might be so valuable to not only the general public but to business leaders. One of the things, we have these 5 pillars for success that is the focus of this summit. One of those pillars is creating a spiritually conscious workplace. Can you just for a couple minutes talk about that? What do you see? And I know you're involved in a number of activities or forums to create a spiritually conscious workplace. Is there any insight that you could share with us there in a few minutes?
Sure. I could talk a little bit about the impact of integral philosophy, which is really much of the source of evolutionary spirituality, this understanding of beauty, truth, and goodness. The thing which has spurred my work since the year 2000 has been this emerging new understanding known as integral philosophy. And I'll get to how it relates to business here in a second. But the quick introduction to integral philosophy is that ever since evolution was discovered, some of humanity's best minds, especially those with a spiritual bent, have been trying to discern what the spiritual message of evolution is, how this, as I said, how this natural fact is a symbol of some higher spiritual fact. And, we have this line of spiritual philosophers of evolution, Henri Bergson about 100 years ago, and then in the 20s and 30s we have Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and Alfred North Whitehead. These are great thinkers, but they're also deep spiritual realizers who've been working on developing a spiritual philosophy of evolution. Other names, include Sri Aurobindo and Jean Gebser. And then recently in the 90s, Ken Wilber has extended this line of spiritual philosophy. I've been trying to add to it. I'm standing on the shoulders of all of these great thinkers, but I'm not a strict Wilberian, if you will. I'm, got my own take on integral philosophy and have been working on that. I have a book which I'm working on now, which will come out shortly. It's called The Presence of the Infinite, and people can see more about that on my website. But integral philosophy is a powerful new way of understanding the world and the evolution of consciousness as a culture, as I've alluded to. And this philosophy has begun to impact business. One of the ways that that's happened is through the work of John Mackey, who's a controversial figure, but nevertheless I know him personally. I can say that he's he's a deeply concerned person and a very spiritually oriented person. And through his getting excited about integral philosophy, he could see how this applied to business. And so he and his co-author, Raj Sisodia, wrote a book that came out last year, Conscious Capitalism. And Conscious Capitalism was significantly different from previous books which had come out about, spiritualizing the workplace or trying to bring spirit to business, all of which are commendable. But many of them, in a sense, were promoted as part of the social responsibility movement, which is certainly good. But a lot of it was kind of just bolt-on guilt assuagement, if you will. In other words, the business was doing its normal thing, in the world, and they thought, well, we have these externalities, we have pollution, we're, not paying our workers as much as we should. We'll just do something on the side that's socially responsible to kind of greenwash our complicity in, the system. And conscious capitalism comes along and says, instead of having it on the side, instead of having the social responsibility be something you do to sort of offset the harm you're doing, we can begin to integrate spirit into the very DNA of the business. In other words, the purpose of the business itself can be made more spiritual, and that can overcome cynicism and find a way of making business itself a platform for a spiritual renaissance. Again, this is a tall order. It's got its own problems and challenges. But conscious capitalism is really a fresh and new way of appreciating how spirituality can be incorporated into the business world and into the nonprofit world and in the world of human work in general. And the key to it, It's got 4 tenets. It's too much to really explicate here in these last couple of minutes. But I can say that the key way that conscious capitalism infuses spirit into business is through the beautiful, the true, and the good. In other words, getting in touch with that which the organization is focused on at its essence, the juice of it, the spiritual experience, that goes with the core value of its service or product, really refining and coming to connect with the beautiful, the true, and the good within the organization is one of the ways of making the business more conscious and thus more aligning it with higher levels of morality than is currently typical in the business world.
Yes. Well, again, fascinating. Let me share, by the way, John Mackey, who Steve referenced. He is he's the co-CEO and founder of Whole Foods, and I mentioned the CEO of Patagonia is also a part of that business group that Steve works with. Let me share the names of those books that Steve has written, because we have had questions come in. I mentioned them when I welcomed Steve to the program. The first one is Evolution's Purpose and Integral Interpretation of the Scientific Story of Our Origins. That's 2012. And Integral Consciousness in the Future of Evolution, How the Integral Worldview is Transforming Politics, Culture, and Spirituality. And I've read that second book, and it is excellent, truly excellent. I'm sure the first book is too, and Steve referenced another book coming out here this year. Let me
go on.
Yes, Steve. I
just wanted to say that my website, if you'll allow me to mention it, SteveMcIntosh.com, has abundant videos and audio interviews and text excerpts from these books. It serves as a kind of a free and miniature workshop on this integral or evolutionary way of seeing, so I can invite people to SteveMcIntosh.com. And then I can also mention here, if I may, the political work that I'm doing with Carter Phipps and Elizabeth DeBold and Michael Zimmerman, other integral writers. The Institute for Cultural Evolution is a political application of this philosophy of beauty, truth, and goodness, and people can see our work at the integral think tank, the Institute for Cultural Evolution, at its website, which is culturalevolution.org.
Terrific. So that's SteveMcIntosh.com. Do check that out. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of the listeners that are here with us on Mother's Day and those listening in during the free replay period, which is 48 hours. Also, I want to share again, during this summit, which ends a week from today, there's this $100 discount on these upgrade packages, and the upgrade packages include the MP3 links, the digital and physical transcripts, and the CDs, not only for this year's program, which has over 30 speakers, but last year's program that included Panache Desai, Joan Borisenko, Ken Wilber, Irvin Laszlo, and many others. So go to that livinginone.com site. You'll see the free replays. You'll see the upgrades. There's a program and replays page where you can leave your comments and inspirations for Humanity's team and for Steve. We invite you to go there. I also want to just thank so much, Steve. I want to come back and thank you. You've been just incredible. We'll certainly have you back to the program. You're just a wealth of information and much more than that, just a nudge to everybody to consider the invitations in life and making it a better planet and becoming a better person. And you just were fabulous. So thank you so much. I also want to thank my colleagues, Dee Meyer, who's a co-host here for the summit, Nanette Kennedy, who's been instrumental in creating the whole summit, Carrie Beach, who's here with us today, and all of my other colleagues. And then again, thanking each of you, the listeners, who are prioritizing time to really come alive as a part of the divine, which is our invitation when we want to really live as one, which is ultimate reality. I want to share what's next up. Annika Komen is coming on in 30 minutes. She's going to talk about how we can become a more conscious person and also conscious business. And she's got a little Mother's Day component to her program. And then after that, Hank Queen is going to be coming on. He is an former executive of Boeing, where he managed over 4,700 people, and who's now doing consulting in this conscious area. So many thanks to everybody. Steve, thank you, and hugs to your family.
My pleasure.
And we'll be back in 30 minutes. Take care, everybody.